Hey y'all, we're back with Horror Joy, and we are having a very special episode of Meet Your Maker. Not only are we joined by Paul Tremblay, an amazing author, New York Times bestseller, has some incredible books. We are also live at Next Chapter Bookshop in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. So if you don't know about this bookshop and you're close by, please come by.
Looks like a super cool place.
Yeah, just want to say thank you for being here again.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
You are actually our first repeat guest. So, want to say thank you. You were one of our first, and you agreed to come on, even though we hadn't published any episodes, which is kind of incredible. So, you're here back. It didn't go terribly last time,
That was great.
and you agreed to come back. So, thank you.
I'm full of joy. I think that's why.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the question, right? We asked you last time what you thought about the relationship between joy and horror was, and didn't know if you had any different thoughts, especially for the kind of audience that we're talking to right now. We're talking to an audience that's a little bit younger. So, is there any relationship between joy and creepy things?
Boy, I wish I remember what I said last time. I say half kidding, but now since I've written another, I think that happened since I've last talked to you. I don't know. For me, I mean, the joy and horror. I mean, there's a little bit of the wonder of. I mean, there's wonder as a part of horror. That's a good way of saying it. Like I gave in this example sometimes. Like I'm a big Godzilla fan. If you could see my full office, you'd see I have a lot of like Godzilla things around. He said, "This is the cute one." Like even as a kid, I remember thinking, "Oh, like if Godzilla was real, I think initially I would be like, whoa, that's so cool that this exists when I exist." But obviously, it'd be really terrifying if a giant fire-breathing monster was destroying cities. I mean, that would be bad. But I mean, to me, that's like sort of the push and pull of a lot of the horror stories that I do like, because there is that like awe of horror, or like, for lack of a better word, the joy of possibility. There's that little possibility. Now, obviously, in a horror story, it goes terribly wrong, but I don't know. It's just like that, the essence of the statement, like monsters are cool. Like, why are they cool? I don't know. It's hard to describe.
Since we have so many younger folks with us here, could you talk about maybe how you got your start writing? Maybe some inspiration for folks here in the room?
Yeah. I got my start way later than I think most writers did, which I hope is kind of cool. Because it's a reminder that like, and it's never too late. You can become an artist or a musician or a writer, at any age that you want to. Because when I was young, math was my best subject, and I wasn't like a very confident kid. So I just sort of stuck with math. Eventually went to college and was a math major. But weirdly, right at the end of graduating college, I fell in love with reading Stephen King. My girlfriend, who's now my wife, bought me one of Stephen King's books, The Stand. And when I went off to grad school for 2 years, I fell in love with reading. And while I was there, I just, read all the Stephen King, and I found other horror writers too. I was also like teaching myself to play guitar. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound like a silly statement, but it took me a while to discover that it's okay to like things. And not only is it okay to like things, it's okay to want to try to do the things that you're passionate about. And I loved music, and I fell in love with writing, and I've tried to do both. Now, unfortunately, I figured out I'm a better writer than a musician. So I've stuck with the writing thing, but I still play music for fun too.
One thing we talked about last time was the fact that you have never read Goosebumps. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'm curious if you have read other middle grade horror stuff that inspired you and what that is.
Sure. So, I mean, the thing with Goosebumps, I think I just had aged out of it. I turned 21 in like 1992 or whatever it was. And I think the Goosebumps were more like in the mid 90s, right? So anyway, I had sort of aged out of Goosebumps, so I never read those. However, I've really enjoyed. Clive Barker has an amazing middle grade book called The Thief of Always. That's a good one. And even more recently as an adult, because I didn't really know what was happening in the middle grade fiction world. And a friend of mine recommended, "Oh, you should read Kenneth Apple's The Nest," just out of the blue. It wasn't that I was looking for middle grade. And she liked the book to the point where she actually physically mailed me a copy. So I'm like, oh, I better read this. And I read it and I was just blown away. I was like, oh, this is amazing. I mean, it's not only is the book itself like a really cool physical thing, because it's almost pocket-sized. Every inch of it is designed with the book and the story in mind. And the art is amazing. And it was really scary and really beautifully written. So that's just sort of like hung in the back of my head for a couple of years. Like, oh, okay. Maybe I could try writing a middle grade horror novel at some point.
Paul, when you're writing a middle grade horror novel, how's it different from something like Horror Movie or Head Full of Ghosts or something like that?
So kids, I don't know if you want to do this at home, but the way I've approached my career has always been, I'm going to write it first and let other people figure out what to do with it. I honestly I felt like I didn't approach the writing of this book any differently than I approached other books that I wrote. to me, what led where it went was the story. Like that's what's ringing in my head whenever I'm writing is, does this serve the story? So in the case of Another, which is from the point of view of a 12-year-old, there's no violence because it's not because it's a 12-year-old, but because the story that I ended up telling didn't need violence for it. Whereas some of my adult books do. So yeah, I mean, I cannot claim any expertise in the middle grade area or any expertise anywhere. I've been saying recently that like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I believe in what I'm doing with, all my foolish heart. In that way, I mean, it, frankly, is now that I'm in this weird place where I've written a bunch of books, it helps keep it fresh for me. It's like, okay, I want to have the confidence that I've done it before, but also I do like the feeling of like I'm starting over every time.
I appreciate the way that you have experimented with form. I mean, the way that you wrote your vampire novel was different than the way that you wrote your pandemic novel, which is different than you wrote this one. And I think that is kind of incredible. So every time that I come to you and your books, I'm also kind of finding something very new, which I think is very cool. So, for anybody who hasn't read this book, I think when I read it, one of the things that I kept thinking about was the loneliness of the pandemic. You talk about this in your acknowledgments a little bit, but this is part of what I think is so incredible about horror is that we all felt this thing together. And loneliness seemed to be one of those things that was a common experience for a lot of people. And I think you captured that here. What do you think that you were wanting to do in terms of highlighting that sense of loneliness? And how did you find COVID and that time during the pandemic to be an appropriate setting for what you were doing?
Yeah, I think before I answer that first, I'm just going to say, because I'm sure plenty of people there haven't read the book yet. The idea that started off the book is sort of hopefully, the fun horror part. The idea that stuck with me was I just had this weird image of a scene where a mysterious old guy carrying a big brown burlap sack shows up at a kid's house and says, hey, I have a new playmate for you. And he opens up the bag, the sack. And inside is this like mannequin clay boy, because the skin is malleable. When I say a mannequin, like it doesn't really have facial features. If you look at a mannequin, it's just like indentations for eyes or a ridge for a nose. But this boy is alive and he can like sculpt a smile on his face and weird things like that. So when I had that idea, I was like, oh, that's really weird. I wonder what I'm going to do with it. And I let it sit for a bit. That's my test if I'm going to work on something is, we all get ideas. And to me, the test, if I want to write a book about it, is if it keeps nagging at me. So anyway, once I knew, I was like, okay, this is interesting to me enough that I need to write about it. Some of this was a little bit of a logic experiment. I was like, okay, why would Casey, who ended up being the name of the main character, why would he be feeling so lonely and isolated that he would accept this strange clay boy into his house? And then it sort of occurred to me, it's like, oh, I think this book, is going to take place back when people were, when students and teachers were doing hybrid learning, where some kids were at home, right? Some were in person, some were on the screen. And so that's how the story sort of made sense to me. Because, I've been a high school math teacher for a very long time, and I still am. I'm probably going to quit in the next year or so. But it became the book that I didn't know I needed to write to sort of honor and talk about what we all went through as teachers and students. That all said, like when you read the book, it's not going to be pandemic every page. I mean, it's talked about maybe 5% of the time, less. Almost the entire book takes place in Casey's house during a school vacation week with this weird friend named Moral who shows up and starts changing with each day that he stays there.
So, Paul, last time we spoke with you about horror movie, you talked about how there's a little bit of you in all of the different characters that you create. So could you talk a little bit perhaps about which characters in this book have some Paul in them? You talked about how your experience during COVID as a teacher informs this a bit, but what about some of the other?
I mean, I think, all the characters have a little bit of something of me in it. I mean, Casey, a little bit. I mean, I think I use my own kids a lot more for Casey. My daughter is an artist. Right now she's in college and she's a visual arts major, and she's an amateur tattooist. So I think you see a lot of my daughter in both Allie and Casey. And the same with my son. My son's a very sort of soft-spoken musician and music production major. So like the idea of art and the importance of art, of creating art, is very much, ended up being, put into this book as well, which I think is, amazingly important, especially in this day and age of AI, trying, and not trying, but actually stealing our books and stealing our art and spitting out terrible facsimile. Yeah. So, I mean, the fun part for me is like you take bits of people that you take bits of yourself and you put into this character. And once they start saying and doing things, they become someone totally different. I don't know, it's like the magic the magic of writing and story.
As I read this, I think the thing that really pops out, at least in part, is how much you value art. Right? In many ways, Casey, our main character, he's an artist. So if there are artists out there and are thinking about how their art not only changes their world but changes them, I think you can find something in Casey that mirrors that feeling. And so I think one question that I have is about how you thought about art as a kind of, maybe salvation is too strong of a word, but like it really feels like the thing that grounds Casey is art. You're a writer. You're also a mathematician. Do you dabble in art? Your daughter does, but are you just an art appreciator besides your literature, which is amazing? But do you do any other kind of art?
I wish. When I was really young, I really wanted to draw, but it just wasn't, it just wasn't meant to, or I would say meant to be, but like I just didn't stick with it, didn't have the talent for it. So I think when I say art, like I'm talking like, wider, like music counts as art, obviously visual art counts as art and writing counts as art, but yeah, for sure. I mean, art makes us human. It's how we communicate, through story. And, I'll try not to swear, but what the evil tech bros don't understand, or I think they're just being obstinate or purposely trying not to understand it, is the value isn't necessarily, I mean, the final product is great, but for the person that's writing or creating the music or drawing the pictures, the act of doing it, the act from where you start, the act of creating is what's worthwhile. That's what makes it unique and special, is that someone with their unique set of experiences created this thing. And then when we interact with art, again, music, films, stories, whatever, like when you interact with it, the other magic part is that you're communicating with the person who created that thing. And that'll never be replicated by, algorithmic plagiarist bots. It just won't be the same. Because I don't know about everybody else, but when I read or watch or listen to something, I feel less alone because I'm like, oh, that person feels that way too. And that, to me, that's the magic. That's the communication. So yeah, again, hopefully, the book does this in a fun way. Like when I say does this, like, I know we're talking sort of like higher minded stuff, but the cool part is if it's there in the story, and honestly, like I could, even though we're talking about all the stuff and happy to, the book says all the stuff way better than I can now. And that's the point of writing a book is, a story describes a set of emotions or things that the best way to describe it is through story. And, hopefully while you're still having fun too with creepy clay kids.
Yeah, so Paul, you triggered a question when you mentioned the evil tech bros without using curse words. For horror as a genre right now, when so much of waking life is horror for so many people, does that make writing horror more difficult? Does it make it easier? Does it complicate it in ways that perhaps horror hadn't been complicated previously? Just like, horror's political, all art's political, I would say.
Yeah.
But how do you navigate this as an author? How do you navigate this as a creative?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's any harder than writing any other kind of story, frankly. I mean, I think, I don't know, I know you weren't implying this, but like sometimes it like annoys me when people who don't like horror say like, oh, how could you write this at a time like this? It was like, well, how can you go get an ice cream at a time like this? Or how can you watch a rom-com? Like, what's the difference? I mean, it's all, different way, except for the ice cream part of it. I hope everyone's getting ice cream. It's just a different way of expressing yourself. So, I mean, whether it's horror or anything else, the art you're going to create is going to communicate some bit of your experience. And of course, it's going to be, influenced by the world. So no, I don't think it's any harder or any more difficult. The world's, I mean, it's a little bit extra right now, obviously, but, the world's always had awful stuff going on. And I don't say that to dismiss, the awfulness of what's happening. But no, if anything, I feel like we need more horror stories now than ever before, go in the other direction with it.
Paul, if you're willing, I think I'd like to make an argument for the book here. So I'm reading this as a person who was 12 once, a long time ago, feels like, but I'm also reading this as somebody who's a parent. And I think the thing that struck me the most, the thing that made me think the most about this book is the feeling of anxiety in that moment when kids realize that their parents cannot always keep them safe, right? So that fear, that horror of realizing that those people who want to take care of you so deeply sometimes can't. And for me, right, so that's the horror of being a kid, I think, in part. But for me also as a parent, knowing that there's times that I can't do that, that's also a strong feeling, right? So the
Yeah.
argument for both kids and parents to read this, I think, is to in some way be seen by that narrative. And I didn't know if you had
Sure.
anything you wanted to fill in that regard. That's putting you on the spot here a little bit in that you're filling in my own argument, but that's the argument I would give. What do you think about
Yeah.
that? If you've got any thoughts about that?
No, for sure. I mean, I think, I think maybe one of the reasons, so listen, like, even though I am older, can I say older? I won't say old. I've been on the kids' calendar my whole life. Right when I got out of high school, I went to college and grad school, then I started teaching in a high school. So I've never left the kid calendar. So I've always, in New England, we get out of school in June. So every June, I'm so excited. And then every August, we go back late August, early September. I'm really bummed out. So I don't know. It sounds like a joke, but I really think that sort of kept me connected to sort of, the kid's life or the kid's emotional sort of state. So like, I'm losing memories of individual things, but I feel like I still have a very clear memory of the emotional life I had when I was like a teenager and sort of that weird excitement and fear of the future. So I think that's really heightened, hopefully in this book, as you mentioned, like, it's not a big spoiler, but, something happens within the house that makes Casey's parents act a little strangely. And as you stated, like, the discovery that your parents aren't always going to be able to save you. Now that's a terrifying thing to learn as a child, but some way I hope that's also a little bit of empowering, especially in Casey's case, because he's got to figure out what to do, right? He's got to figure out not only how to help himself, but maybe even help his parents too. So in a weird way, I think maybe this book might be more frightening for parents than for kids. Although I do think it's creepy. I mean, I'm scared of everything, though, is also my secret. That's my superpower. Everything is scary. So whenever I write, it goes there anyway.
Yeah. So, Paul, with Morel, is there a touch of AI in Morel, or is he more of like anti-AI?
Oh, he's 100% anti-AI. So when I first started the book, I sort of realized the image of the clay boy sort of came from something that I saw as a kid. Like, I wasn't thinking this when I thought of Moral. While I was writing, I was like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, there was this show called The Muppet Show. Anyone know what Muppets are? Like Kermit the Frog, all that stuff. In the late 70s, early 80s, they used to have like a show that was like on like prime time, like 7, 8 o'clock at night. And it was sort of like a fun variety show where there was music and there was comedy. But anyway, so on The Muppet Show, they had this weird Swedish troupe called Mummenschanz. These guys performed and they were dressed in like black leotards and just had big blobs of clay on their head. And one guy was like sculpting the clay to look like a really amazing face. And the other guy was pretending to be not very good. And he was making like really grotesque stuff and like extending his chin. And back then in like the early 80s, I don't think it was in front of a live audience. It was like canned laughter. So like if you can go to YouTube and watch it now, if you Googled Muppet Show Mummenschanz, good luck spelling Mummenschanz, by the way. Yeah, it's like, wait a minute, they shouldn't be laughing. This is really strange and horrific. I mean, so for me, that's like the fun part of sometimes figuring out like where weird things come from. Now, I started the book in spring of 23. In June of 23, I joined a lawsuit, myself and other writers, suing ChatGPT on behalf of all writers. It's not just me personally, but it's a class action lawsuit suing ChatGPT because they steal our books and stuff them into their machines without paying us, without asking us, and certainly not giving us an option as to whether we want our books in there. I mean, they literally take the books off the pirated sites on the internet. So yeah, like, I mean, when I was writing the book was right around the time I was learning about that. And the same thing with like Midjourney and other sort of AI art producing things. It's the same thing. Those bots just take other people's art without their permission, don't pay them, and spits out this really crappy art. So yeah, I think maybe at times, like, it's just sort of a nice happenstance that I think like there's a few times as Moral's changing, he looks really strange. Maybe he does look like AI art at some point. And Casey makes a mention of it, I think, at one point in the book too. But again, we already talked about like the value of art is the actual producing of it, as well as obviously what you have at the end.
So let's keep talking about Morel. I think that for me, I have seen this kind of fungal turn. So for those of you who are not all that into horror yet, right, we've turned to the fungal as a kind of image of horror. And I just didn't know if you were deliberately kind of entering into that space, into the fungal turn, as it were.
You're asking if he's a fun guy.
Are you a fun guy? Well, Morel is a fun guy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't purposeful. It was more like I had what I had at the beginning, sort of the clay boys, like, well, like what is he? Like, what is he really? Like, what sort of supernatural thing? And, I tend to default to try to make things seem somewhat realistic. as opposed to, oh, it's just like a haunted Play-Doh person. Like that wouldn't have made much sense to me. So yeah, without getting too more spoilery. So I kind of went, in that direction. I do like mushrooms on my pizza though, but not when I was a kid. I mean, no. Now that I'm an adult though, or mostly an adult.
Okay, we're gonna stick with one more morel question. In my head, I said morel because
Yeah.
I was thinking morel mushroom, but my daughter, very smart, she was at science camp all week, much smarter than me. She read it as moral. And as a dumb philosopher, I thought, whoa, is there some connection between morel or moral and the kind of ethical conversation, right? In many ways, it feels as though the struggle that morel has or moral has, I don't know how we're saying it,
Yeah.
is really the struggle of the book, right? And even the struggle of AI and the struggle of parenting and the struggle of childhood, right? He's the one that it seems like is the focus of all those questions. So that morale, was that deliberate or was that just an amazing kind of creative thing? You talk about like trusting your weird brain. Is that
Yeah.
just a time where we are thankful that you've trusted your weird brain?
Yeah. And the funny part is the first time, like I've done a few readings, like just a few chapters here and there. And I did one recently this summer, and I didn't know how to pronounce Moral's name. Like I started off as calling him Morel, and I switched to Moral, and I was like, I don't know. Even though his name is very purposeful, it is a hint to sort of as we talked about the fungi. So now that so this book, more than probably actually more than any other book that I've written. Normally, I know the beginning, obviously, and then I usually have a pretty good picture of the end. And in some cases, like I've had the last line of the book in mind, and then I had to figure out what's the big, how do I get from A to B, or A to Z, I should say. In this case, I actually didn't really know what the ending was going to be. This was like the most open-ended thing that I'd started, and I didn't write an outline. So one of the joys of writing this book for me, I mean, there was quite a few, but like Moral probably surprised me the most, more than any other character, with where he ends up, because I don't want to spoil it too much. But yeah, like as you said, like his story becomes one worth exploring, and he's not what you expect him to be, I guess is another way of saying it.
You're being introduced to a new generation of people, right? As writing a middle grade novel, you started writing late. If you could go back and give yourself either a piece of advice or just an inspiration as a young person thinking about writing, what would it be?
I mean, I think part of it would be a little bit of what I mentioned earlier. I think it's worth saying again, just like tell the younger me that, hey, it's okay to like things. It's okay to be passionate about them. It's okay to be you. I mean, that's part of figuring out who you are. And I'm always excited when I meet young writers, because to me, that means they're, even though they may not feel super comfortable in social situations all the time, but if you want to be a writer and you're writing already, to me, that's cool. You've already figured out part of what's important to you and what you want to be. And the same thing with music and visual art and drawing as well, or any kind of art. Yeah, I would tell the young me also, hey, read more books. That's really the biggest thing. I mean, you cannot write without reading. You have to read a lot, read all sorts of different stories. Yeah. And then like, it's okay to try. It's okay to try and fail. We're talking about all the things that got published, but I've had, countless rejects. It took me 2 years to find an agent, hundreds of rejects from agents. I mentioned it took me 4.5 books, or my 4th book that I wrote was the first one that I've sold. So, it's hard. I mean, writing especially, I think you don't get that instant gratification that maybe comes from writing a 3-minute song, or where you draw something really cool and you get to show it to everybody and you get that instant gratification. On the writing side, that can be really delayed. And it, really relies on you having to enjoy the process on some level, to be some of its own sort of feedback.
I don't want to leave without asking you about the phone. So you open this with an old rotary phone, and this ends up being like a very creepy artifact because like people don't know what to do with them.
Sure.
But it taps into all the phones we've talked about on this podcast in the beginning of Scream, in Black Christmas, Halloween, all the phones. Was that something you were thinking about?
Not the movies per se, but like when I introduced the phone, it actually becomes quite important to the story. And I think when I first introduced it, I didn't know how important it was going to be. And so one of the fun challenges, and maybe one of the only thing of, that's not true. I guess I did a little fungal research as well. But so when the mom buys an antique rotary phone and it rings when it is supposed to, and that sort of starts everything. One of the fun challenges is like, how the heck am I going to describe what a rotary phone is to young readers today? If you go on YouTube, there's some videos of very cruel parents putting a rotary phone in front of their children and timing how long it takes them to figure out how to make a phone call. And part of that phone was sort of like, I felt like it was a little bit of karmic revenge on the world, because I've spent so much time saying there's no such thing as timeless fiction. Like And I had to fight with the editors a little bit. They didn't want me to mention the pandemic at first, and like didn't want me to mention YouTube. I'm like, what? It's like, no, there's no such thing as timeless fiction, right? Like whoever reads this is going to be set in a setting. Anyway, so yeah, writing about the rotary phone was kind of fun. The last thing I would mention is this came up like I was on vacation with family recently. Like when people talk and pretend they're on the phone, like a lot of adults do this, right? So I asked like my friend's like 10-year-old kid to like, hey, pretend or mime that you're talking on the phone. And they did this, just like talking directly into a smartphone. It's just, whoa. Like, I mean, it was just kind of really cool and a nice reminder, you know, just to see the different perspectives and how that's going to affect not only how you consume art, but how you make it and stuff like that.
Yeah, they'll never know the joys of Raffi's banana phone, Paul. It's a shame.
Yeah, or stretching the cord from like one room to the next.
All right, well, Paul, we're going to end with our usual question, which is, what in horror is bringing you joy recently?
Oh, man. What in horror is bringing me joy recently? I'm trying to think of something I really watched recently or read that I really enjoyed. Well, so I finished my next adult novel, and I have edits right now, but I finished at the beginning of the summer. And one of my rewards was I was going to reread a couple of books of my favorite books, partly to help me jump into the next book after that. So anyway, I reread Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night, which is just such an amazing book. And, you know, it's not like, you know, happy, fun things don't necessarily happen in that book. It's pretty horrifying. But I don't know, I get such a charge for reading that book, like such a spark of inspiration. And that's what I still love about reading. Like when I read books, especially, you know, Mariana, that's something I could never do, but that doesn't disappoint me or daunt me. It makes me want to try harder and maybe take a little spark from that book in some way and try to build like a different fire kind of thing. So, you know, that's for adults. Sorry. For younger readers, I would definitely recommend Kenneth Apple's The Nest or Clive Barker's The Thief of Always. And it's an older one, but because if you like visual art, Clive Barker is an artist too, and he draws a lot of wild art to go along with his books.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul, for those answers, for joining us here on Horror Joy, and for letting us meet you as a maker, as it were. If you're willing,
yes.
We would love to kind of move into a question and answer with the folks here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I love it. I was going to say, like, if there are any drawers or visual artists, if you read the book and are inspired to draw something, you know, give it to the bookstore and they'll email it to me and I'll put it on my Instagram. I would love to put up, you know, art inspired by the book.
That's awesome. So draw some stuff and we can send it to Paul. Are there any questions for Paul? I know a lot of us haven't read the book, but Paul is an accomplished author. He's got lots to say about art. Any questions that we have for him? John, we'll go with you first. So Paul, if you didn't hear, how did you react to the movie adaptation of your novel, Cabin at the End of the World, made by M. Night Shyamalan?
Yeah.
Knock at the Cabin? It's not Knock at the Cabin Door.
Yeah, there's no door.
That's a thing you don't like. It's Knock at the Cabin, right? All right, I'll let you say it.
Yeah, the grammatically incorrect title. Although I'm just a math teacher, so I don't know. Yeah, Knock at the Cabin. So, I mean, the movie itself, I don't like the ending. I mean, it sort of undercuts to me like the point of why I told the book. It was a very sort of personal book in a lot of ways. But my favorite part of the movie is sort of its look, but also I think the actors really nailed it. I think all the actors nailed sort of the emotional lives of those characters. You know, and it's impossible for me to be objective. It's such a weird feeling that I was very lucky and privileged to experience, like to write a book and then see it on screen. You know, it's also just really weird. It's hard to describe the weirdness. Like when I saw it for the first time, I was in a theater in New York City and it was the premiere. Walked down the red carpet. That was weird. I'm just gonna say weird a lot. But when I would watch the movie, when it opens, like I got teary-eyed because like the characters were saying the same things that I wrote. And then very quickly at one point, I was like, oh no, I'm never gonna be able to watch this again. And then at one point I was fantasizing getting up from my seat and sprinting out of the theater and just running down the middle of the streets in New York and wondering if anyone would notice. But by the end of the movie, I was okay. But I was like sweating like I just jogged 10 miles. Not that I jog. So yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I like the movie, don't love the ending. You know, the other weird part is that so many more people are going to know that story as the movie than the book, you know, which is a good problem to have. But at the same time, like, you know, I do think the book is better, which is usually the case. A bookstore in Tucson, Arizona bought me a shirt that said the book is better. And I don't try to wear that every day because that would be really obnoxious.
Okay, so the question, Paul, was of finding joy in horror. What's lost, what's gained with something like a book adaptation to a film adaptation?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, there were things I admired and how Knight was able to get information across with just images, which was really cool. Obviously, you can't do the interiority of what the characters are thinking. But, you know, it's funny. So I mentioned earlier, I wasn't really a big reader as a kid. I mean, I read what was given to me at school, but I wasn't as, for the last, 30 years, I read 70 to 80 novels a year. I mean, that's how I learned how to write. So even though like my first 20 years, what I knew of story was almost exclusively movies. And now I've obviously played catch up and now it's flipped. Like, I mean, I definitely watch movies, but I read way more books, and that's really my preferred sort of mode to get story. Now, obviously that said, there are brilliant movies that I adore and watch over and over again. The thing that sort of disappoints me, and especially in the direction that many studios are going toward, is just that, man, they're just so stuck on it has to be like a 3-act structure and all these other things called beats that just sound like you're plugging story into a formula. And you can see it. It becomes, I don't know, not as interesting. It just becomes so predictable. And it's like, I want to ask some of these studio people, it's like, have you ever watched an Asian horror movie or a European movie? Like where there's, who knows how many acts there are. I just wish that Hollywood would sort of not just automatically like use that as like a stamp. Now, obviously there are independent studios like A24 and Neon that are doing, cool experimental stuff. And those are the things that I end up enjoying more, to the point where like, other than Jordan Peele, I have a really hard time coming up with like major studio horror movies of the last 10 years that I enjoyed. So I don't know if that answers the question. Sometimes I get joy in not liking a movie, but that's not a nice joy. So I try not to crap on people's movies that they like.
Any other questions for Paul?
Yeah, so the question is about any experiences or how your relationship with students shows up in your writing as a teacher, as an author, as a horror creator.
That's a great question. I sometimes joke that I'm like an energy vampire, and I just take sort of the energy, not the souls, like I steal their souls, but I'll take like their energy and their voice. Being in a school is a great lesson if you're as a writer, is hearing dialogue and hearing voice, and like how slang changes every year. Like, my school is a small school, and like it feels like every 5 years, like it changes. Like there's, especially now with social media, there's countrywide slang, then there's sort of like region-specific slang, and then there's sometimes even like just school-specific slang. Now, I'm not going to use all that slang in my books because, it would sound really cringy if I start saying no cap, like I do in my class just to make my students cringe. But even though I'm not like taking the exact, slang that they're using, but just like the rhythm and the pattern of how people talk, I mean, I find that just really interesting as a writer, not even as a horror writer. As a horror writer, I don't know. Like, just being a teacher, not that I need to be kept grounded, but those kids could care less. Like a couple of examples, some of them could. At this point in my classroom, I've got like Stephen King posters, and I've printed out the tweets when Stephen King had tweeted nice things about my books. And when the kids are giving me a hard time, sometimes I've said to them in low moments, like, hey, like outside of this room, you don't understand. There are people who think I'm cool, and they're like, no. I've had people say, Stephen King, who's that? Yeah. So you never know what you're gonna get in class sometimes.
Other questions?
I think the thing that sticks out to me the most of what I heard you talk about tonight is that you're afraid of everything, but you're a horror writer. So, but is that the point? I think that's my question, is like, is that the inspiration for your writing, that you find the thing that you're afraid of, and then by writing out its eventuality, does that work it out enough that it's somehow less scary, or does it amplify the fear and you're just sharing that fear with the rest of us?
It's probably more of the sharing part. That's a great question. What was I going to say? Yeah, it definitely doesn't work it out. Like, that's been a big disappointment. They're like, oh, if I write these scary stories, then, I won't run up my basement stairs really quick because it's creepy down there. Or like if my wife is traveling and the kids aren't home and I'm by myself and I have to, I'm going to sleep by myself, it's a coin flip and it's usually heads. Then I'll be sleeping with my wife's like desk lamp on. I just can't help it. I don't understand. I don't understand why. It's just not how my brain works. So sort of, as you mentioned, my brain's always churning through like worst case scenario type of thinking. And so, it probably does help to have me write it out kind of thing. All that said, like all the scariness said, and I still have nightmares, like kid nightmares, I still have monster nightmares and things like that. But the joy of horror, the hope of horror for me, even if like stories are really scary or grim or don't have a happy ending, like I feel hope in that communication against like, oh, that writer gets it, or that writer feels the same way I do. And again, that makes me feel less alone, even though it's like a really scary story. So yeah, I'm still a scaredy cat. I mean, I can say this now that I'm not going to bed. I still hope I will be a scaredy cat, because I think if I am, then I don't know. I feel like my imagination is dulled or I've just given up.
Paul then got a question from a young reader about whether or not he could capture the childlike wonder of becoming an artist and how he would incorporate that into his books.
That's a great question. I mean, I try to do that in another, frankly. Like, I mean, Casey's a very young artist. You know, he's very good, but he's also just starting out. I think the cool thing about writing, and it's probably true for all art, but I can only speak really to writing specifically, is I only need to put some like scaffolding, or I really only need like the skeleton of things, and then the reader brings their experience, and especially if you're an artist, you fill in some of the details for me. So as a writer, you know, it's hard to explain how I do it or how you do it, but that part of my job is to not over-explain everything and leave enough space for people to bring their experience to the characters too. And honestly, like the easiest way or the best way I think to do that is just to approach every character with empathy. Like even the villains, you know, and empathy doesn't mean sympathy, right? Empathy means you want to understand them, want to understand what they're doing. Sympathy, I have no interest in. You know, sympathy is rooting for the home team. Sympathy is, oh, I like that person because they look like me and talk like me. You know, our country's in big trouble because too many people are focused on sympathy and on empathy. Sorry, I don't want to get all preachy. But, oh, shoot, I had something else to say. It was going to be really cool and fun, and now it's gone because I went preachy. Anyway, sorry. I hope some of that made sense.
How do you view the challenges of writing a short story versus the challenges of writing a novel? Are those different challenges for you?
Yeah. I mean, there are different forms. Like when I first started writing, first started getting serious about writing, maybe in the early 2000s, I was writing exclusively short stories. And then when I had to start over with figuring out how to write a novel, like the first novel I sold wasn't the first one I wrote. It was like the fourth and a half that I wrote. You know, it's kind of funny now that I'm in sort of in novel mode. I find it a little bit harder sometimes to go back to short stories, or that the short stories are getting longer than they used to be. But I've never had the experience where, oh, I sit down and write a short story and then it blows up into a novel, or vice versa. I've never had, oh, I think this is a novel idea and it turns into a short story. I think for me, like short stories tend to be like, I know they're going to be a short story because it really focuses, like a laser focus on a sort of one scene or an instant in time that I just sort of maybe instinctually know that, okay, this is going to be, you know, this is going to be a short story and not a novel. Whereas, you know, the novel ideas, like, you know, in the case of this book, for example, with the old man showing up with the burlap sack, I thought this could be a novel because I wanted to figure out who Casey was, you know, and why would he accept Moral into the house? Why would his parents? You know, where's his sister? What's going on? So like all those different types of questions made it pretty clear to me that was going to be a novel. But again, I go by feel so often. And, you know, you just learn to trust your subconscious a lot as a writer or an artist or a musician too, I would imagine.
So, Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
With our live audience here at Next Chapter Bookshop in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. Could we please get a round of applause for author Paul Tremblay? Paul, we look forward to what comes next, and hopefully we'll be talking to you soon about horror and joy.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming out I assume it's really hot. It was really hot up here in Boston today. But thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And thank you to Brian Beckel on sound, and of course, Danny Fry for letting us use the space. Next Chapter Bookshop. Buy your books here. It's amazing. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.